guys dove into that because it's now no longer Nycoon. And there's a lot of history there, but owned by Northland, there's, that's a major player elsewhere. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. But
we have we do have a lot of marine renewable energy, so wave and tidal, and a lot of First Nations related things out here. We have this Prime Center that does that, and a lot of that's about the First Nations relations piece, and they kind of totally screwed the pooch up there in Haida Gwaii with that. But technically too, there is no transmission line to take significant amounts of power. So that whole project was predicated on building a big transmission line, and those things cost a lot of money. And then Jamie, I don't know if you look at trying to build a transmission line now is like harder than a wind turbine. So that it just kind of that's what's driven me towards some of these renewable fuel, e-fuel things, because I look at it as these stranded wind assets. Especially if you go floating, you can just put them out to sea, away from people, make some fuel, and hopefully if you get a high value product there without having to build transmission capability. I think there's, at least in Canada on the West Coast, lots of impetus for that. So
and further to Jamie's work, it is interesting every time you look at social acceptance for offshore wind. It's distance from shore, as long as you can't see it. It's not there. So it seems to really drive that. Sorry.
Yeah, like Curran said, the transmission lines are huge, and I will say that there's a report circulating in the Task 28 group about social acceptance of offshore from all these other countries that you're mentioning. We have one fellow from Japan, and they're doing floating offshore, but they still have the same types of issues once it gets to the shore. So a lot of that report has to do with the transmission line. So it's basically social acceptance of transmission. A lot of familiar issues, including EMFs.
Yeah.
So when that report's available, it'll be on the Task 28 website. But
great.
It's working its way through.
That's the legal framework document is posted there in the chat. People are interested.
Thanks, Curran. Much appreciated. Lindsay, did you have any publications coming out of your working group, or anything you can share with us about some of the messages and
I will also barriers? I'll post it in the chat as well. The paper that we wrote, I'll do that while we're on here as well. So, but yeah, similarly, we did find, we were surprised, Curran was saying, on how little was available when you start to look into what the real policies and legal framework, and there was very little available in Canada, so that was also a bit surprising for us as well. But yeah, I'll post our paper here as well.
There is this group, they're working on floating offshore wind for Canada. I don't know, it's a company actually. I put the link here. I don't know. And the last time I talked with the CEO, they were dealing with legal issues and also getting permits. So that's also something interesting that we can look into that. I think they have lots of experience now about how to get permits and how walk through the legal aspect of things.
Great, thanks, Rad. Yeah, we've seen a presentation from this group as well. So I think they're looking at a floating wind demonstration plant that could be used to produce hydrogen or ammonia or other products, I believe. I think they were planning a 1/8 demonstration scale, or at least conceptually. So I guess one role for a potential kind of national advisory committee or something like that would be to look at where such a demonstration project, should it go ahead, where it should be located to maximize the success of the project in terms of acting as a foundation for a potential future offshore wind industry in Canada, and the consultation that has to go around that. And obviously we've mentioned a number of different perspectives related to like environmentally sensitive areas, to coastal communities, to technical and geological aspects that all kind of need to be considered in relation to one another.
Does anyone have a sense of how the East Coast utilities are looking at offshore wind? Is that something they're actively considering much, or?
I don't believe it was mentioned in Nova Scotia's recent integrated resource plan. They are talking about more onshore wind. So it's still kind of something on the margins. And Nova Scotia is probably considering it more than the other provinces, the other Atlantic provinces right now. I don't know if you had any other insights, Jordan.
Yeah, I think that holds true. Lindsay brought up some good points that there's a lot of land still, whereas so there's a lot of interesting research coming out of this area in Atlantic Canada in terms of all the like taking into account all the characteristics in terms of load and weather and wind patterns and how you load. And it's been interesting looking at how offshore wind is being incorporated into some of those analyses and how it can kind of fill a gap. But I personally, this is non-government sanctioned comment here, but I do see that green hydrogen may play a bigger role because all of a sudden any excess energy, there's no such thing as excess energy because you can turn it into a fuel that can be stored. So it'll be interesting to see that play out there's active projects now in the North Sea. So we'll see. And that Canada has come out and said that's a part of our energy future. So we'll see how that plays out.
Hey, Jordan, I liked your presentation. I liked everybody's presentation today. I had a question for you. You had the spectrum of different marine foundations there, including the foundations for mooring lines for floating. So if we just made a presumption that all future offshore wind was floating, by the time Canada gets its act together, it could very well be the case. Would that increase the number of places you could put these turbines in terms of the quality of the bed for foundations for floating moorings? Is it more forgiving than, say, having some kind of a submerged jacket, et cetera?
I think it's unfortunately kind of a moving target because there's so few of them. So as it stands right now, there's the ones that are being emplaced are just being emplaced in fairly typical seabed. So there's no, other than water depth, there's no real difference in the seabed geology, from what I understand. Now, there's been some interesting work. I'm on an advisory board of a demonstration project south of the border that is using drilling into bedrock micropiles, which would obviously open up a larger portion of the shelf. In general, just the water depth issue, when you just open up so much more shelf, and in deeper waters, you generally get deeper sediments. So you're really opening up a lot there. So long answer is probably is probably less of a constraint, seabed geology, but it's hard to say. I think technology will just continue to improve on floating, so that ought to really make a difference.
Yeah, I concur.
Yeah.
Ryan, I wanted to ask you something actually about the potentials for the this offshore wind compared to onshore when we want to basically meet our climate goals. Has there been any study or investigation that what would be the role for offshore, specific to Canada, since it has been brought up several times that we have a lot of land that we haven't used?
Yeah, it's probably kind of a gap right now at a national level. There's some interesting work coming out of Lucas Swan's group at Dalhousie University about the correlation between the provincial load, existing onshore wind, and potential offshore wind. And the idea would be that if you have higher, steadier, more consistent winds in the offshore, and located in different geographical locations than the existing onshore wind, that there could be advantages in terms of meeting more of the provincial demand. And so I think that that's a concept that could definitely be explored further in other areas. But there's this gap, I think, in terms of like looking at long-term capacity expansion of renewables, and kind of where offshore wind can fit into that in Canada. Maybe others on the call have more experience with some of these longer term studies and looking at potential for offshore wind, but I haven't seen a lot on that subject, particularly for Canada.
And not necessarily Canada specific, but the high wind stuff off of Scotland is showing capacity factors up into like 60% plus. And if you think of the green hydrogen piece, your business case is all running those electrolyzers 24/7. So I think that capacity factor thing could really help your case there as well. I think it's always all the cost progression curves people use to do these longer term projections. Offshore wind's always more costly, but I don't know how they represent things like public acceptance in Ontario. Like, I don't think you're going to build another onshore large wind farm. It's just really hard, or wherever you are. So. I don't know, Martin, I was interested in your thoughts around the high voltage DC transmission. Where is that relative to conventional AC transmission, and what's upcoming there?
I mean, it seems that the cost break-even point between just running an AC line or running an HVDC line seems to be somewhere at the 50 to 100 kilometers distance from shore. I think for the North Sea has lots of opportunities to interconnect between different countries. So you may not just build one line to a wind farm, you might just interconnect with neighboring ones. It gets more complicated, but wherever you have clusters of wind farms that are further out makes sense. And it seems so 50, 100 kilometers seems to be the rule of thumb from an economical standpoint, from what I have read.
Does the proposed energy island in the North Sea, I think the Danish are leading that. Is that a potential ideal application of that, or?
As far as I remember, they want to integrate that into an HVDC connector system between, say, the UK and the Denmark, Germany, and the Scandinavian countries. So that would very much play into that, as far as I remember. But I would have to go back on the details too. On a similar line, interested in the sites that you've been looking at, the distances from shore, that for the sites that you consider more likely, where is that range that you have seen?
Yeah, it's interesting. Out of the project, and it already my current position, and Sable Bank was included because of Sable Island. So there's a little circle drawn around it and said, well, that's land, so we should include it because it's close to land. But it ended up being fortuitous because it's now those banks, their distance to coastal Nova Scotia, like the mainland, is I think it's within 200 kilometers. Don't quote me on that. I'm drawing a blank now, but anyway, so it's well within the range of what's being built now, like Dogger Bank and some of the larger wind farms in the North Sea. So. So those offshore banks are within the the realm of what's being built in terms of the larger farms currently. And then the other sites of opportunity, the smaller sites, are all very close. They're within 10 meters of shore.
Okay. Jordan, can I elaborate on that question or
Sure.
dig deeper? This is Nat Pree from Lucas Swan's group, who came up a moment ago. Your cross section of bathymetry showing all kinds of different features and the bedrock appearing and sediment pockets. It implied to me that there were fairly short spatial scales of consideration. Right. So we were the author of the study looking at the correlation of the wind resource to load and reliable capacity issues, and we did not. I mean, we know our limitations, and we did not do any sort of exclusion related to suitable geology. Mm-hmm. In order to do so, obviously, we covered a vast spatial scale that would require years and years of survey ships going around if you wanted to do it in any kind of accuracy. Is it worth at this point considering that, or would you simply say would we say, well, this area has favorable characteristics, and can we do a survey on several kilometers or several tens of kilometers spatial scale, and will there be, I guess, will the variability in suitable foundation conditions, suitable geology, geomorphic conditions, can they be extended? Do they exist? Can you rule an area out for many kilometers in a direction, or is it a very fine scale problem?
Yeah, I would say that if I think I'm capturing your question correctly, we tried to kind of, again, we're just doing a regional overview. So we dove down into the fine scale data where it exists, but of course it's a very large offshore. So you can only pinpoint those lines or those small swaths of high resolution bathymetry data. The areas that we identified with potential are those small areas where we just happen to have lots of high resolution data, or the offshore banks where Sable is very well surveyed, and Banquero less so, but it generally has the same characteristics. So those are really the only places that we could say at a larger scale, it's a higher probability that you'll find similar geologies from one place. So we try to kind of capture some of that variability in the regions closer to the mainland. Example, like that profile off of Nova Scotia, by just saying it is really highly variable, and that there may be opportunities like Milne Bank offshore Nova Scotia, but they just haven't been surveyed. We just have a lack of data, because at that scale, you kind of have to throw a dart at the map and luck out kind of thing. So we kind of characterize the inner shelf of mainland Nova Scotia as just being highly variable and unlikely to have that continuous deep sedimentation that you're looking for. Right. Does that answer your question? Or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess, so what we can say is there are very few areas where you could simply establish a uniform grid, as we see in some of the North Sea offshore wind farms. Yeah. And any specific location other than these few choice banks that you mentioned would require much more detailed spatial scale analysis.
Yeah, and it's a really good question, because I only recently, you get kind of you get your tunnel vision on what the data that you're looking at and sort of the field that you're immersed in, and then you kind of have to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. And I did that recently. I had to take a step back and look at all the lease offerings that are going on in the United States. And I was thinking, what would that look like here? And it wouldn't look like that. They wouldn't just draw a big block, well, that's a certain distance from New York, so that's great. And then, this is federal water, so that's great. So check, here's a box. And we'll lease it out and you guys do all the surveying and everything. And I don't think that will be the case here. I think it'll be more nuanced, or there'll be more technological advancements that allow for this kind of variable geology to be more conducive to a survey and to a company leasing kind of thing. But yeah, I don't think we can just draw big blocks based on water depth, and probably the geology is fine for big swaths of Atlantic Canada.
I work on a couple of offshore wind projects in Europe when I was working in Europe. And then, so answer your question, Nat, to some extent, is we do for very large wind farms, they divide into clusters. And then you look at each cluster from geographical point of view. And then you look at, well, first thing is each monopile design is specific for the location based on geological situation that you have. Another thing is when you calculate the loads for your wind turbine, at each cluster, you look at the highest frequency and the lowest frequency, because the frequency is the most important thing in terms of calculating load on your wind turbine. And then based on that, you say, okay, this is upper limit, this is the lower limit, what would happen to the turbine? And then you like sort of extrapolate it to the rest. From load calculation point of view, it is the way it works, at least. Yeah.
Thank you. Interesting.
All right, everybody. So this was a great discussion, and I really enjoyed everybody's presentations. I think we're supposed to try to go back to the main, well, if you're not interested in the post-webinar discussion, then you're welcome to exit this room. If you are interested, you can join us back in the main forum, I guess. I think there's going to be a discussion on that book chapter if anybody who's interested in the cold climate book chapter. But otherwise, I just want to thank all the speakers for their time today and thank everybody for the discussions that we had afterwards. Oh, sorry, I just see that that discussion on the book chapter is actually not going to happen today. So you can just email Yves Gagnon if you have, if you'd like to participate in that. So thanks everybody for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and Marianne will be in touch with everybody. I know there's a follow-up webinar plan to talk about sort of a wrap up in the next direction. So it was really nice to talk to you all today, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks everyone for joining the discussion. I'm looking forward to continuing it in the near future.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.